Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Vampires, and a rare out-of-character video for that particular series. In this video, while I'm wearing the Harbinger of Skulls pin, I am not going to be speaking as one of them. This topic is, I suppose, a little bigger than that. It's more along the design side of things, and it was one that was requested. One of my subscribers by the name of Kieran, who purchased, at this point I can't recall, The World Below or Monster Kingdoms in hard copy, made this request, as of course you are entitled to do. If you pick up either of those books in hard copy and contact me through matthewdawkins.com, you can request a video of your choice. And this one has been a little while in the making. Because this is why it may well have been The World Below that Kieran bought. The reason I point it out, and I mentioned in my video earlier in the week, The World Below is the only RPG that I get royalties from. So I need people to pick up that game and would love it if you check it out. It is a subterranean fantasy game, absolutely filled with World of Darkness style politics, horror and intrigue, as well as having the survivalism, the exploration, the wonder, the dread of playing in a perpetual Underdark. It has done very, very well. I'd love for it to do even better. So if you haven't checked The World Below out, I will be linking it in the video description below. But this video is not focusing on The World Below. It's focusing on a book called Kindred of the East. Kindred of the East was a role-playing game supplement, a large supplement to Vampire the Masquerade. And it is not a game that has dated terribly well. That isn't to say Kindred of the East is a bad game. There are some very, very strong concepts in it. The writing in Kindred of the East is often sublimely brilliant. Mechanically, it has heft, it has its weight. The powers are explosive, they're interesting, they are horrific. The setting material, likewise, delves really deeply into a lot of Asian horror. But there are problems looking at it through a modern lens, which I think would be foolish to skirt over. Kieran wanted to know how I would readapt Kindred of the East for a modern audience, and so that's what I've been thinking about since he made his request. It's not an easy game to release for the 21st century, especially here in 2025, but that isn't to say there aren't salvageable parts, and in some cases, many salvageable parts, in fact. I don't think it's a game you can write off entirely. Now, none of this said, there isn't going to be a 20th anniversary edition for Kindred of the East. That time is long past. There isn't going to be a 5th edition of Kindred of the East in its prior incarnation or anything that resembles it, because these days, much of Kindred of the East feels exoticized, orientalized, stereotypical, offensive, to put it simply. Now, different people are going to be offended by different things. Some people claim to never ever be offended at all, which I don't believe. But the fact of the matter is, it isn't a game that stands up as particularly mature to today's audience. I think you could still play it, the original version, and have a lot of fun with it, but the cracks are visible, so to speak. So I went to work thinking about how would you revise Kindred of the East for a modern audience, keeping its core appeal, vampires, conflict, spirit world, tension between tradition and modernity, while removing or reframing its more offensive tropes of exoticism, orientalism, stereotyping. I drew on reader and fan discussions in places like Reddit and RPGNet to suggest what players would like to see, what parts are salvageable, what needs to be changed. So the problems in the original, in very broad strokes, Kindred of the East tends to portray Asia, or the East, as a monolith. Mystical, timeless, exotic, morally different, uniquely burdened, other. This contributes to a rather negative stereotype, it has to say. The lore often slides into yellow peril tropes. Vampires of the East are a different species, hostile to the Western kindred. There's a sense of cultural essentialism, if you like. The moral or metaphysical burden of Kindred of the East, Hun, Po, Chi, Yin and Yang, and unbalance, tends to exoticize Eastern religion and spirituality. It divorces it from real practices, simplifying or treating it as mystical scenery rather than a fully lived belief system, I would say. And then there's the terminology, organization, and setting, often borrowed from Pan-Asian stereotypes, bureaucracy, feudal stuff, spiritual monsters, mysticism, etc., without nuance. Local differences, internal diversity, ethnic, religious, cultural, political, are glossed over. Now, I know what you might be thinking at this stage, 5 minutes in. Well, this isn't a game line that had a great deal of releases. It didn't have many source books that came out for it. Maybe that material would have come in time. And I agree. I think Kindred of the East had room to expand, had room to develop nuance. It wasn't a game that saw a huge shelf life. And quite often, games need to go through various iterations, revisions, new additions to get into the really strong material. So I think it's perfectly understandable that the Kindred of the East we know is as entrenched in all of the material I've just stated. You tend to peel away a lot of that stuff, and you get the same in Vampire the Masquerade, you know, with the Giovanni, the Assamites, the followers of Set, the Ravnos. The exotic clans tend to be regionally focused, culturally focused, and often exploit certain stereotypes with it. So, looking at reimagining or rebooting Kindred of the East, I thought there's 6 points I want to hit, and you'll have to excuse, this is a rare video where I want to refer to notes, and sometimes I'm going to be doing that. You'll see me looking off screen, or looking away from the camera briefly, because I want to make sure I get the message across here. I feel like a Kindred of the East for the modern era needs to respect cultural specificity, easy for me to say, recognizing the huge diversity in what East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, etc. actually mean. Language, religion, folklore, politics. Avoid treating Asia as one thing. Number 2, decenter mysticism as exotic otherness. Spiritual beliefs, magic, ghosts, etc. should be treated with as much nuance as any belief system, not merely mystical wallpaper or foreign flavour, but something that's meaningful, internally consistent, often disputed, and dynamic. 3. Modern relevance. Assessing where modernization, technology, colonial history, global trade, diaspora, migration, and social change are factored in. It's one of those interesting things where Kindred of the East, because it was developed so late into Vampire the Masquerade's initial life cycle, you don't really see much of the Kindred of the East, the Wan Kuei, outside of Asia until you start looking at later city sourcebooks such as San Francisco, which was for Kindred of the East. This implies that these monsters have remained penned on one part of the globe for all time until we get to a certain point. And you can retroactively amend that, but it does highlight again some of that focus. So the vampires, or equivalent undead beings, need to exist in a world that is not frozen in a nostalgic past or being eternally medieval, basically. 4, agency and internal conflict. Let characters and cultures in the East define themselves. Don't make East versus West always a binary. Many internal tensions between modern and traditional, between local and global, within religious or spiritual practices, and so on. 5, an inclusive perspective. Ideally, you want authors, designers, and storytellers from those cultures, or who can research those cultures. I'm not someone who believes that to write about a certain part of the world, you have to have authors from that part of the world. It's a very useful thing to have, believe me, and can add a very flavorful voice. But that isn't always what's available, and that means you can find reliable writers who will approach their subject matter with maturity and sensitivity, who will go to the library, who will research papers, who will find out about those cultures that they're writing about, rather than just turning on Seven Samurai and saying, well, All Asians must be like an Akira Kurosawa movie. Having things like disclaimers about this is fiction, not accurate anthropology is sometimes useful. I know some people find that kind of thing useful. I'm less bothered by it, but I get that some people are. 6, a variety of playable perspectives, not just one kind of Wan Kuei, or Kuei Jin as they used to be known, but many lineages, many styles, many beliefs, possibly even different mechanics for different regions or different mythic traditions. So you're really balkanizing, to perhaps use the wrong term, Asia by this point by actually saying, well, if you want to play a regional game where then being in the East is a primary element of the game, well, these areas need to feel different. So in terms of what a change or what a reboot would look like, looking at terminology and identity, rename or drop the terms Kuei Jin and Kindred of the East as monoliths. Use terms drawn from local languages and mythology, maybe local names for undead beings. The term vampire can still be used, but define local variants more fully. Rename metaphysical mechanics, e.g. instead of Hun, Po, Yin, and Yang, which are appropriated and simplified, use more specific and local spiritual concepts, or offer multiple roads, as one Redditor suggested. Change the dharmas into roads. Simple. That means you're then aligning the game more mechanically with, if not V5, V20. Although V5 has its own paths of enlightenment, so I don't see why it isn't possible. When you're looking at folklore and mythic beasts, you want to incorporate authentic folklore, monsters, spirits, legends, but not as weird things the East has and the West doesn't, but as part of the world building. Examples might include, but would require careful research and consultation, Jiangxi, Nuriona, Penangalan, Aswang, Yakshas, etc. I am sure that I have mispronounced many of those. Use these with respect, let them have cultural narrative logic, moral ambiguity, agency, and variety. None of these beasts should be single-minded killing machines. All of these things should be capable of negotiation, have their own internal hierarchy, that kind of thing, because that is what adds depth to a setting. Allow for some reinterpretation, perhaps some vampires are misunderstood people who became mythic beasts, etc. Perhaps mortals' stories about vampires are distorted versions of these beings. This helps avoid flat monster tropes. So then when you get into the political and social setting, you want to build in colonial history. I think that's very important and is kind of what is missing, in my view, from Kindred of the East. This isn't to suggest the British Empire wasn't it great. It's more to suggest that implying that these monsters, let's say, stayed confined to China, as if China was never visited from any other part of the world over the past millennia, is rather narrow-minded. So you want to look at modern nations, you want to look at diaspora, you want to look at globalization. For example, how Japanese imperial history, British colonialism, Chinese imperialism, modern communism, modern authoritarianism, globalization, trade, technology, etc. All of these affect vampire societies. How would they affect the Wan Kuei? Include urban, rural, coastal, mountain, island settings, very different cultures. I'd want city sourcebooks for different parts of Asia. The role of cities versus remote villages, for example. Asia is a part of the world where you will still find remote villages, especially in China, especially in India, where certain local cultural traditions hold sway beyond Buddhism, beyond Christianity, beyond Islam. The impact of modern media, globalization, internet, immigration, all of these things need to play a part in how the Kindred of the East, or whatever we're calling them, are being presented. I appreciate I'm belaboring this point, but having them be a singular group, having them be locked in time, is a fun thing to explore. And I feel Kindred of the East has now done that. You've got a book that does it. But we need to bring them into the 21st century and present them differently if you were going to present the game in a new way. Vampire sects or courts should reflect local political forms rather than just being copies of the Camarilla or the Sabbat. Perhaps some vampire sects mimic local power structures, monarchies, bureaucracy, clan systems, religious hierarchies, or are shaped by colonial rule. When we get into the mechanics and powers, we want to reduce or simplify the metaphysical burdens in the original, being Hunpo, Yin Yang, Demon Chi, etc., so that they feel meaningful instead of just burdensome mysticism. Allow flexibility. Players choose what burden or spiritual code they follow, perhaps conflicting ones. Let unbalance and corruption be more morally grey, not simply you fell into evil. Gifts or disciplines, your powers, should be grounded in the mythos, but not pigeonholed into cliché oriental wizardry. For instance, themes of spiritual possession, shape-shifting, ghost haunting, ancestral spirits might be powers, but they need cost, risk, and ethical implications. The power should vary with region and lineage, like in folklore, so that beings from Indonesia versus Korea versus India versus Mongolia give different traditions. You want to consider mechanics for spiritual reputation. For example, how mortals see you, how ghost stories grow, how mythic reputation influences your kinds of power, but also how misinterpretations and superstitions can become dangerous, and your character's acts spawn legends, essentially. When it comes to playable clans or lineages or such, you want multiple options, some derived from Western or Cainite vampires, some from local undead traditions, maybe some hybrids. Each lineage with its own mythic background, moral tensions, strengths, and weaknesses. Characters should have choices, follow tradition or innovation, isolation versus cooperation, public identity versus secrecy. Maybe some lineages are more open, others more secret or underground. And in all of that, you'd want to present older traditional elders with burdens and younger postmodern Wan Kuei who grew up in modern cities, diaspora communities, etc. This gives variety and provides a more, I would say, a more impactful delineation than Camarilla and Anarch. If the youngest Wan Kuei, the ones we're examining in this 21st century, because I'm not saying retcon the original material, I'm suggesting Wan Kuei that have been created in the last 25 years or so have very much exploded from their origin points, and so they have very different cultures to the originals. In terms of narrative tone, identity, belonging, betrayal, change, cultural exploitation and conflict, spiritual debt, modernization versus tradition, diaspora, colonialism, as mentioned, rather than just mysticism versus rationalism. Horror can come from spiritual dissonance, colonial trauma, technology versus spirit, moral compromise. And in that, the tone should be more mature or reflective. Be horrific, but also possess dignity, maybe as a counterbalance. The whole point is basically to avoid mocking or reducing beliefs just for the sake of saying, this is our Eastern game. And as mentioned, avoid the monolithic East versus West, especially usually when that gets presented, the East is seen as strange and mystical, and the West is civilized. Less us versus them, more complexity. So, to make this more concrete, as a setting, for example, I came up with something. This is all sketch work. This is all brainstormy. So I hope this is what you're after, Kieran. Firstly, name. The Kindred term remains for those tied into the global Cainite mythos, but indigenous undead traditions are called different names. Some pre-Cainite or parallel. The setting no longer uses East versus West as the core conflict. There's overlapping spheres. Roads and philosophies instead of dharmas, players choose paths or ways, which are philosophical, spiritual traditions tied to culture or region. Again, change the path of enlightenment if needs be, e.g. way of the ancestor, way of the spirit wind, way of renewal, way of darkness, each with pros and cons. Regional courts and sects. Kindred of the East did go into this a little, but it didn't spend a great deal of time exploring the cultural variation. So in each major cultural region, I should say, not traditional region, Japan, China, India, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, there are vampire sects. whose structure is influenced by local politics and historical systems. You want to find a way of blending the two, I would suggest. Almost, well, sometimes putting them into conflict, sometimes having them complement each other. So having your imperial courts, clan systems, bureaucracies, and religious orders. These sects all have internal factions, modernists, traditionalists, exiles, etc. When it comes to the creatures, each region has its own mythic undead or spirit creature, some of which intersect with vampire lines. So this means you can explore some of the less overtly playable monstrous options that are explored in Asian mythology and have them as offshoots, hybrids, mutations, devolutions of your Kindred of the East. So they might have independent societies, some are allied or in conflict with the vampires that you're playing. So the Penanggalans in Malaysia, Jiangxi in China, Preta in India, Southeast Asia, and so on. When it comes to mechanical balance and burden, which was a big part of Kindred of the East, something like spiritual debt and spiritual path can fill the role of more moral and metaphysical cost. These should be customizable, perhaps even contestable. Some characters believe debt must be repaid via service, others believe in gracefully moving or seeking transformation. Players can have conflicts over what their character's spiritual obligations are. Ghosts and spirits are not always malevolent. Sometimes they're burdens, sometimes they're allies. I like the idea of a game where ghosts play a greater support role, the ghouls, if you like, to your Kindred of the East. And finally, getting back around to the modern versus tradition challenges. I think themes like industrialization, environmental destruction, colonial legacy, modern government, supranational powers, etc. For example, vampires hiding in megacities in China and Japan are going to have a very different life than vampires living in the rural wilds of Tibet, for example. You could look into how such creatures use technology to stay hidden, deal with broadcast media, social media, etc. Also, with it, spiritual decline, secularism, revival movements, etc. I want to just get back briefly to how to avoid stereotypes when working on something like this. Well, you research, you can put your disclaimers in. Again, I prefer just framing the material in a way that is less open to ambiguity, I suppose. Diversity in voices, both in character and as writers. Avoid generalizations. You want a balance of power, because it still needs to be appealing, and most games are power games, and nuance. And language. Language matters. If you're writing a game and you want it to come across as mature and not stereotyping, you want to avoid terms like mystical, ancient, and exotic. Avoid oriental flavor just as decoration. Use cultural terms, culturally appropriate terms, if you have appropriate cultural terms to use. From what I was able to tell when I was looking into this, and I made a list of what I could find fans were interested in from Reddit and RPGNet specifically, fans want Kindred of the East updated, with old racist exotic tropes removed. They want the concept, but with greater nuance. They want a more accessible system. The original's metaphysical burdens are sometimes considered too complex, hard to use. Fans want simpler, more intuitive mechanics, but still the sense of spiritual and metaphysical weight. They wanted better integration with Vampire the Masquerade and other World of Darkness lines, so that Kindred of the East doesn't feel completely alien, but can cross over. They wanted more folklore-based lineages and clones of classical mythical undead, rather than only Chinese or Pan-Asian supernatural bureaucracy. And they wanted regional differentiation. Politics, beliefs, ghosts differ in countries, different countries. Players want variety. So I came up, based on Kieran's suggestion, with, and these are very broad strokes, some suggestions for what some of your roles or lineages could be. So the ancestors, you're mostly looking at Japanese, Korean, some Chinese clans here. Their distinctiveness is they're tied to family, honor, ancestral spirits, strong in dealing with ghost and spiritual obligations. Their strengths and weaknesses are their obligations make them vulnerable to spiritual debt and conflict with modern life. The hungry ghosts, or wandering preta, India, Southeast Asia, Himalayan regions. Their distinctiveness is they are burdened by unfulfilled desires or wronged deaths, in between mortal and immortal, perhaps marginalized by other vampires. So this is your Nosferatu or your necromancers. Their strengths and weaknesses, well, they're weak in corporeal power, but strong in spiritual influence, might attract fatal attention from spirits or the mortal world. Jiangxi revivalists, very much Chinese. Undead, reanimated, or transformed bodies, strong resilience, themes of rigidity versus adaptability, cultural duality, that's their distinctive side. Their strengths and weaknesses, their vulnerability is change and mobility, modern life. They can conflict with authorities who view them as dangerous undead beasts. Then you've got, and right now, very general term, they are just bureaucrats. I need better names for these things. They would come from historically imperial courts, colonial or post-colonial structures. Their distinctiveness is vampires who navigate political power, legal systems, colonial legacies, perhaps managing cover, secrecy, influence over mortal systems. Their strengths and weaknesses, well, they're political intrigue heavy, so ventru, torrid, or like. Moral compromise is a thing you could explore with them. Risk of exposure, tension between modernity and tradition, again, with them being on the modern side of the bracket. And then you have diaspora vamps, or urban spirits, if you like. Cities across Southeast Asia in particular, diaspora communities globally. Distinctive nature would be those who live in modern cities, tech, immigration, hybrid identities, perhaps more flexibility and innovation. Their strengths and weaknesses, they're often disconnected from traditional support, more exposed, suffer identity crises, but they can adapt more easily, they can blend in. We're looking at things like a technological obfuscate, potentially, or even a cultural one. Other roles or paths are necessary for a game like this rather than fixed lineages. So someone could be of the ancestor line but follow a more modern or skeptical path, or someone might reject tradition in favour of a more pragmatic or secular vampiric approach to existence. I'm not done. I appreciate this is a very long video. This is very much I wrote a lot of ideas down. And if you've been following all the way up until now, thank you very much. There are some fantastic threads about this on RPGNet, on Reddit. I very much recommend checking them out if this is your thing. And this is just a consolidated dump of ideas that I put down. I appreciate there's some repetition here. This is just how I work through things, but hopefully some of this is engaging. In terms of mechanical revisions, the spiritual and moral debt system, replace or revamp Hunpo, Demon Chi, Chin, Yin Yang with something more modular. Characters pick or are assigned spiritual duties and debts based on their origin choices and lineage. Failing to meet obligations causes consequences, which can be mechanical, loss of certain powers, attracting spirits, etc., or narrative, shame, ostracizing, or both. Spirit reputation, folkloric echoes, mortal stories, rumours, ghost stories have real weight to these characters, these Kindred of the East. If enough people believe a myth around your character, it might awaken something, draw attention, etc. That allows folklore to be dangerous rather than just decorative. Differentiated power trees, so lineages, or whatever we call them, get powers rooted in folklore or spiritual beliefs of their region. For example, an ancestor line lineage might have gifts that let you call upon ancestral spirits. A Jiangxi lineage might have regeneration or undead resilience, etc., but with drawbacks. Maybe one power costs a spiritual debt, maybe certain gifts are taboo in certain cultures, etc. And social or political tools. Since politics, colonial history, modern states are relevant, we should, in a game like this, provide mechanics for influence, reputation, secrecy, mortal law, media, diaspora, networks. This isn't a million miles away from what is already in V5 in a lot of places. It's just the kind of thing you'll want to consider if adapting Kindred of the East for a modern audience, I think. Conflict need not always be supernatural. Sometimes it's legal, societal, cultural, and much as with my preference for Vampire the Masquerade, most of your dealings should be with mortals over other undead. In terms of potential setting changes, I think the game should be set in a global present rather than a romanticized past. Vampires in contemporary Asia mixed with cityscapes, technology, modern social issues such as migration, inequality, authoritarian governments, or environmental destruction are all powerful. And likewise, we spoke about crossover. That's exactly the kind of thing, the latter one, that you could bring in your werewolves if you wanted. But also allow flashbacks and histories to old eras, colonial times, mythic past. You want to introduce conflict zones relevant to Asian histories, e.g. occupation from invaders, imperial collapse, war, migration. These shape vampire societies and should be called upon. Not just stuff from the ancient past either. We're looking at the 20th century. China, Japan, both of them went through a huge heap of changes in the 20th century, not to mention Korea, among pretty much every country in Asia, quite frankly. I don't think there are many countries in the world that have remained static over the last 100 years. So to constantly look back to ancient times, trying to call upon ninjas and samurai and so on, is the error there. I think you want to be looking at more recent history. Include the diaspora, vampires who come from Asia but are now in the West or other regions. Their identities, beliefs, cultural obligations may be in tension with their surroundings. I think there is something there. This is the risk with material like this. You can have a character like that who appears in San Francisco, for example, or hell, let's stick them somewhere in Des Moines, Iowa. You end up there, well, if you have various powers and various traditions, various gifts that play on your tradition from wherever it is in Asia, you're probably going to have a harder time than if you were playing in a game set in your region of Asia. I don't think that's a problem per se, because that's a reflection of real life. Migrants do sometimes find it very difficult to live somewhere that has no expectation of their culture, where assimilation is practically nil. Play around with that rather than amplifying it as exotic. Have it as scary. Have your characters feel isolated. Make the friends they make be prone to suspicion. Make your characters paranoid because you don't know if these people are going to betray you when you're no longer useful. More emphasis needs to be placed, in my view, for a modern Kindred of the East on mortal beliefs. This was almost completely absent in the previous edition of the game. How local culture sees undead, ghosts, vampires, and how folklore and modern media intersects. Horror movies, religious revivals, internet rumours, podcasts. The Masquerade or its equivalent should reflect local conditions. What makes a masquerade harder or easier in cities with strong belief in ghosts or in rural areas? Now, I appreciate this has gone on for a long time, and I've not provided any specifics like, can you roll these dice to do this thing, and that's not the point of this video. It's just to show, really, that you can, in my view, make a modern Kindred of the East. You could make a modern Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom. You could make a modern Kindred of South America. The game of Vampire doesn't always need to be focused on Europe and North America. And it is very easy to do away with all of these cultural specifics and just say, well, it's Cainites all the way around the globe. You can do that very easily. But I think you can also actually examine these cultures and pick some really fun material from it. That as long as you're being intelligent when you're doing it, as long as you're not writing this stuff just to poke fun or exploit, there's so much good material there. It seems foolish to ignore it, and even more offensive than just saying, well, everyone's descended from Cain, which, by the way, is a myth I absolutely hate. in Vampire the Masquerade. I rarely use the word hate to do with anything in role-playing games, but the idea that every vampire is descended from Cain, that should be a myth. It could be a popular myth, but it should still be a myth. There should not be evidence of it. Anyway, a modern reboot of Kindred of the East should keep what people love: the tension of spiritual debt, myth, ghosts, vampire politics, the clash of tradition versus change, but it must drop or rework the parts that exoticize, oversimplify, or essentialize Eastern culture. Instead, it should bring depth, variety, representation, and moral complexity. By localizing the mythologies, diversifying lineages, integrating modern socio-political realities, involving voices from those cultures, and using mechanics that reflect moral/spiritual complexity, rather than just supernatural otherness, Kindred of the East could become not just more acceptable to a modern audience, but richer. That's the hope. More evocative and more compelling. So that is what I wrote on Kindred of the East, a modern revision. And I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts. What kind of things did you love in Kindred of the East, and what parts did you not love? I would love to see your comments below. Are any of you playing Kindred of the East now? Have any of you checked out the threads on Reddit, on RPGNet, where people are working on their own revisions for this game? For my money, it's not a game I could ever see getting re-released now or rebooted. You can still buy it on DriveThruRPG. It's not banned, but I think its time, as presented previously, has passed. It'll be very interesting to see if we ever do get a new regional variation for any of these, but I guess time will tell. Thank you very much for the video request, Kieran. And as for the rest of you, if you want to request a video, by all means, pick up a hard copy of The World Below. The link to do so is in the video description below. And get in touch with me via MatthewDawkins.com. Let me know you've bought a copy and request a video. Thank you very much for watching. Be seeing you next time.